Hello and welcome to an episode of Historically Marked. I am Jason in South St. Louis. Specifically, I am at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, and this is a very large cemetery. More than 250,000 interments are here. Yes, that's 250,000. And yes, all of our heroes are lying here, men and women. People who served in all wars are buried here. Both Union and Confederate soldiers are buried here. There's also some unknowns. Well, those are marked. But then there's also 8 Medal of Honor recipients, which I'll be visiting all of those. And plus, some notable and some famous, as defined by findagrave.com, as well as the cemetery. But I will be more than happy to show you around this legendary cemetery because, yes, there's going to be lots to see. So come with me, we'll start the tour. And again, this is a very, very huge cemetery. I mean, not as big as, say, Arlington National Cemetery, but it's definitely bigger than a lot of national cemeteries. I mean, besides it being historic and being one of the oldest. But you really gotta know where you're going if you're wanting to find somebody's memorial, be it a loved one, a friend, or a famous person. There's an app you can download if you want to do it on your phone or print it out on your computer at home before you come here, or you can go to that building right there. They'll be more than happy to look for it during opening hours, during the administration building. There's also a map at certain places around the cemetery. But right over there, well, you can't see it, but it's way back there. I will take you to the original part of the cemetery. And here I am, what is considered to be the original part of Jefferson Barracks, or what is called Old Post. Like anything that's marked OPS, whenever you're searching for somebody, you'll find it here. And it's divided into many sections. Like this is, I believe this is considered the oldest section. But this was years before this became a national cemetery during the after the Civil War. But it was strategically put here on the banks of the Mississippi River, which is just right there. And then that stairway goes down to another section of the cemetery, which is newer than what I'm standing on. And so that's why you'll find many graves that are, you know, like what you find at any other cemeteries, like these right here. And this young gal was the first interment here, Elizabeth Ann Lash. Well, it says on here Eliza Ann Lash, but she was the infant daughter of an officer stationed here at Jefferson Barracks, and she was only 1 year old, sadly. And I am glad that though they've kept her marker in great shape. I mean, the same goes for all the other markers. Like you can tell this one is very old. Like you can't really read any of the text underneath where it says William and Martha Griffin. Another early interment was the unfortunate passing of the son of Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. I hope I'm saying his name right, but Zebulon Pike, who was a famous soldier explorer for whom Pikes Peak in Colorado is named after. But his 2-year-old son, and I don't think he was ever given a name, but he passed away in 1806. November 23rd. But this area is located in the northeastern part of the cemetery, which is designated as Old Post Drive. Like east, it's divided by east, west, north, and south roads. And most of these burials were set aside for the burial of military and civilian personnel who died at the Jefferson Barracks garrison. But it wasn't until 1869 when the cemetery experienced enormous growth, when more than 10,000 recovered remains of soldiers were originally buried at other Missouri locations all over the state. We're talking about like Cape Girardeau, Warsaw, Rolla, and they were all removed from those places and they were all reinterred here. And while I'm here, I'm going to check out a couple memorials here. One, it's really hard to read, but it says here, in memory of our soldiers of the Revolutionary War who died at Fort Bellefontaine, Missouri, 1806 to 1812. Unfortunately, the rest is hard to read, but it says here they were like whatever they could do. They were removed here to April 15th, 1904. And then another Fort Bellefontaine related one. Now, I did a video at the Fort Bellefontaine Park, and I mean it's a huge park, and I'll put the link to it in the description box. But that was the former military site before Jefferson Barracks was moved here south of St. Louis, which is now present-day Lime. But this is a memorial to the unknown soldiers who died while in camp between 1806 and 1826 at Fort Bellefontaine, which was on the Missouri River bluffs near St. Louis. It would be like Blackjack and around Florissant, if you want a much better idea, but it's in North County, present day. But in 1826, this cantonment was closed and the troops were moved to Jefferson Barracks. The remains of the officers and soldiers were reinterred in this National Cemetery by the U.S. government on April 15th, 1904. And this was put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then it was rededicated on June 2005. At the corner of Long Street and Monument Drive, this is considered the hill, one of the highest points of the cemetery. And you get quite a nice view. Like from here, you can see the Mississippi River. You can see some of the old Jefferson Barracks buildings. And then you can also see parts of the St. Louis skyline and the arch. But I want to take a look at that monument in just a moment. That is the Minnesota monument, but this marker is about Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery as a whole. So Jefferson Barracks, established by the U.S. Army in 1826, was in continuous use until 1946. Early in the Civil War, both pro-Union and pro-Confederate militia occupied St. Louis. Union militia drilled at Jefferson Barracks. In May 1861, pro-Confederate forces were expelled from the city. Throughout the war, Jefferson Barracks served as a hospital. The Army converted existing buildings and erected new ones to serve as medical facilities. By the end of 1862, more than 5,000 sick and wounded had been treated at Jefferson Barracks General Hospital. In excess of 18,000 Union soldiers passed through it by the time the war ended in 1865. And with the hospital came the need for a cemetery. The Jefferson Barracks post-burial grounds had been in use since August 1827. By the time of the Civil War, more than 600 soldiers and civilians had been buried there. The National Cemetery, established in 1866, was expanded beyond the post cemetery. By 1869, it contained more than 10,000 graves, the majority known. Among those interred were 1,006 Confederate prisoners of war, and then Civil War monuments. Sculptor John K. Daniels of St. Paul, Minnesota, designed the female figure holding a laurel wreath, a symbol of glory and victory. The monument was erected at the intersection of Long Street and Monument Drives, which of course is where we are. Dedicated on May 15, 1922, it honors 164 Minnesota soldiers buried here. It is one of 5 Minnesota monuments placed in the National Cemeteries. In the early 20th century, Annie Wittenmeyer, tent number 3, Daughters of Union Veterans, erected a monument to the unknown Union dead interred at Jefferson Barracks. And we'll take a look at that too. So according to my research, there was actually 7 Minnesota monuments. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but of course the marker says there was 5, and this was the last of them to be erected at the National Cemetery. But it says here the remaining 6 Minnesota monuments were constructed at the following national cemeteries: Vicksburg and Shiloh, and then Marion, Indiana, Memphis, and Little Rock. But I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this real quick. I know the sun's kind of bright. Erected by the state of Minnesota in memory of her soldiers here buried who lost their lives in the service of the United States in the war for the preservation of the Union. Very nice. And just not too far from the monument is Daughters of Union Veterans of the Civil War monument, in loving memory of our valiant ancestors who fought to preserve the Union with a loyalty to God, country, and flag for a just and lasting peace. see what it says in the back. This was put by the Julia Dent Grand Tent number 16. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln quote. It was dedicated in 1995. And just a year later, there's also a smaller monument by the Daughters of Union Veterans of the Civil War to honor the Union women who fought on the battlefields, nursed and comforted the sick and dying, and sacrificed their own lives to preserve our nation. It was also put up by the Julia Dent Tent number 16. And now we're going to go into the Confederate area. And next to those memorials is In Memory of the Unknown Dead, dedicated by Annie Wittenmeyer, tent number 3, Daughters of Veterans, USA, St. Louis, Missouri. The quote on top says, "On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, while glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead." So who was Annie Wittenmeyer? Well, she lived from 1827 until 1900, and she worked to bring food and supplies to wounded Union soldiers. She was instrumental in reforming the horrific conditions in hospitals and battle camps. She was well respected by Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant for her philanthropy and heroism. I want to see what it says in the back here. Okay, it doesn't say anything. But we are now going to look at the section where most, if not all, Confederate soldiers are buried. And then over here is a monument entitled Memorial to the Confederate Dead. This was placed here by Jefferson Barracks on May 1st, 1988. And it is not to be confused with the Confederate Memorial that was once placed at Forest Park. It is that one, the one I'm speaking of, is waiting to be moved someplace. But this one was also placed by the Jefferson Barracks Civil War Historical Association, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and the Missouri Society Military Order of the Stars and Bars. And as you can see, it features the Confederate battle flag, the last national flag, the blood-stained banner, as well as the first national flag of the Confederacy. And then down here is a quote from Barry Benson. Who knows, but it may be given to us after this life. If you want to read the rest of it, I'll go ahead and, if you want to pause, I'll slowly pan on it. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there are Confederate burials in this cemetery. So I'm going to go ahead and read off what it says here. Military prisons in St. Louis. St. Louis had 2 small Civil War prisons, each housing several hundred persons. Gratio, I can't even pronounce it. Gratio Street Prison was the former McDowell Medical College, located near 8th and Gratiot Streets and the Mississippi River. When the Civil War began, Dr. Joseph Nash McDowell left St. Louis, eventually joining the Confederate Army. The college became Gratiot Street Prison in December 1861. The U.S. Army installed bunks and stoves in classrooms, and the dissecting room became a mess hall. The building could hold 500, but often exceeded that number. The prisoners arrived on Christmas Eve, 1861. A 2.5-story brick building at the corner of present-day Clark Avenue and Broadway, owned by slave dealer Bernard M. Lynch, became Myrtle Street Prison. The Army confiscated Lynch's slave pen after Lynch fled south. With barred windows, it needed little alteration. Among the first prisoners was Max McDowell, a son of Dr. McDowell, who had remained in St. Louis to recruit soldiers for Confederate forces. Both prisons also held civilians, including women and children, deemed Confederate sympathizers. Both facilities closed in summer of 1865. And this talks about the Confederate burials. Some Confederate prisoners who died at the prisons or in hospitals were initially buried in Christ Church Cemetery. Others were interred by the firm of John A. Smithers and Brother at Wesleyan Cemetery. About 1867, the U.S. Army moved the remains of more than 1,000 Confederate prisoners interred in St. Louis cemeteries to here, Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. This included 6 burials removed from Quarantine Island and a prisoner removed from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. In 1908, the Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead placed the distinctive pointed top headstones on the Confederate graves at the National Cemetery. Because St. Louis prisons also housed Southern sympathizers, many of the dead were civilians. The commission was only authorized to mark the graves of soldiers, but the War Department authorized the use of Confederate-style headstones to mark civilian prisoner graves. Among them were 2 women, Jane Ann Foster and Nancy Vaughn. And then over here, toward reconciliation. On May 30th, 1868, the Grand Army of the Republic decorated Union and Confederate graves at Arlington National Cemetery. 30 years later, President William McKinley proclaimed, "The Union is once more the common altar of our love and loyalty, our devotion and sacrifice. Every soldier's grave made during our unfortunate Civil War is a tribute to American valor. In the spirit of fraternity, we should share with you in the care of the graves of the Confederate soldiers." The War Department created the Confederate section at Arlington in 1901 and marked the graves with distinctive pointed-top marble headstones. 5 years later, Congress created the Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead to identify and mark the graves of Confederates who died in northern prisons. This mission was later expanded to encompass all national cemeteries that contain Confederate burials. 4 former Confederate officers headed the commission over its lifetime. By 1916, it had marked in excess of 25,500 graves and erected monuments in locations where individual graves could not be identified. In 1930, the War Department authorized the addition of the Southern Cross of Honor to the Confederate headstone. And this picture right here is the Confederate Cemetery in northern part of Alton, Illinois, which I plan on visiting in the future. So what they're talking about is this section. Yes, you'll see the difference between Confederate and Union sympathizers. I mean, like right in front of me. Here, let me look at the names real quick. Like this guy right here, J.W. Mulcahy, a civilian. And then there are some that say unknown, like unknown soldier. And then most of them just say civilian or which regiment they served. And I also want to show you this memorial chapel, which is found in the west area of the cemetery. Now, this memorial chapel was built to remember the selfless acts of Americans to defend their love for God, home, and country. The Korean and Vietnam Gold Star mothers and fathers sponsored the building, which was dedicated to the ultimate sacrifice of all veterans. And this was dedicated in 1978. And by the way, this is the first memorial chapel that was donated to a national cemetery. And I'm going to get up close to it real quick. And then it says, yeah, Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States at that time. Dedicated 78. This is one of the entrances. And this is actually the front part of it. And that is the main entrance, just right up that sidewalk is. And just within distance of the chapel is a memorial. I'll show you that in a second. But I'm going to show you the A2nd Airborne Infantry Division, U.S. Army, to our honored dead and to all soldiers who have served their country in the A2nd Airborne Infantry Division. Activated August 25th, 1917 as the 82nd All-American Infantry Division. Participated in the Lorraine, Saint-Mihiel, and Meuse-Argonne campaigns in France during World War I. It was reactivated March 25th, 1942. Post-World War II, 1945 in Berlin, the division became known as America's Guard of Honor. And this was dedicated in 2004. And this is a memorial I often see at many other cemeteries as well as in front of courthouses. And this is dedicated to the recipients of the nation's oldest military decoration, the Purple Heart. And this was donated by the Military Order of the Purple Heart, Chapter 125 in Fenton, Missouri. And now here is the St. Louis World War I Veterans Court of Honor, dedicated in 2012. And this is dedicated to those with a Gold Star Court of Honor with a missing plaque. both of these, and their names are right here as well as over there. And then here, just as you're going, like if you make a left from the entrance, like where the flagpole is, like you go on what is it, yeah, Flagstaff Drive, and then at the corner of East Rostrum you'll see a bunch of memorials, and I'll show you each one of them briefly. Like the one in front of me is the Navy Seabees, which I've seen at many national cemeteries. United States Marine Corps, dedicated to all Marines and those who serve their country with the United States Marine Corps faithfully since November 10th, 1775. This is a bench in the Gateway Chapter Chosen Few from December 1950. This monument is dedicated to the 52 United States submarines lost during World War II and their crewmen and officers who perished in that war. World War II, erected in 2003 by the surviving members of the Illinois Missouri Rebel Squadron, a chapter of the United States Submarine Veterans of World War II. Let's get a close look at that. Continuing on, dedicated to the memory of those who served with the 4th Marine Division in World War II from 1943 to 1945. In memory of Navy and Coast Guard sailors who served on destroyer escort and APD shifts. Trim but deadly. Dedicated by the St. Louis Chapter Destroyer Escort Sailors Association on October 25th, 2003. The 3rd Infantry Division, U.S. Army. The 3rd Infantry Division was organized on November 21st, 1917 and was in France by March 1918. On July 18th, it distinguished itself in a defense at the Marne River at Château-Thierry, 45 miles northeast of Paris. Thus, the proud motto, Rock of the Marne. The 3rd fought, with distinction in all European theaters in North Africa in World War II. The division had played a critical role in the defense of South Korea and then returned to Germany as part of the NATO defense forces. A brigade from the division participated in the Persian Gulf War against Iraq in 1991. This is dedicated to all sea service women, be it the Navy women, Navy nurses, the woman Marines. Dedicated on May 9th, 1998 by Gateway Waves number 5. A fallen hero memorial dedicated to and in remembrance of the Marines and FMF corpsmen who gave the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom, dedicated September 28th, 2013. And finally, a monument dedicated to the memory of merchant Marine seamen and Navy Armed Guard who gave their lives in World War II in service of their country. Dedicated by SS Samuel Parker Chapter, American Merchant Marine and Navy Armed Guard veterans on November 11th, 1998. I'm in the Old Point lot here at the cemetery, and there are three men who served in the Revolutionary War, and 2 of them are right in front of me. Unfortunately, at this time, I'm not able to locate the 3rd guy, Richard Gentry, but I'll explain more about him. Here, I'm going to talk about Thomas Hunt. So about Colonel Thomas Hunt, he was born in the colony of Massachusetts. He was a sergeant in Captain Croft's company of Minutemen at the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. On January 1st, 1776, he became a member of the 25th Continental Infantry and transferred to Jackson 19's Continental Regiment as a captain on February 1st, 1777. He was wounded at the Battle of Stony Point on July 16th, 1779. He transferred to the 9th Massachusetts Regiment on January 1st, 1781, and was wounded again at the Battle of Yorktown on October 14th, 1781. After the Revolution, he remained in the Army. He would become a captain in the 3rd U.S. Infantry on March 4th, 1791, and was promoted to the rank of Major on February 18th, 1793. He was reassigned to the 1st U.S. Infantry on November 1st, 1796. Promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on April 1st, 1802, and finally as Colonel on April 11th, 1803. Colonel Hunt died August 18th, 1808, and was buried at Fort Bellefontaine, which is now a park, but his remains were removed and they were taken here to Jefferson Barracks in April of 1904. So let's get a good look at this. And next to him was Major Russell Bissell. He was born in the colony of Connecticut and was a veteran of the Revolutionary and Indian Wars. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in the 2nd U.S. Infantry on March 4, 1791, and to the rank of captain on February 19, 1793. He transferred to the 1st U.S. Infantry on April 1, 1802, and was promoted to major upon return to the 2nd U.S. Infantry on December 9, 1807. He was the commanding officer at Fort Bellefontaine at the time of his death on December 18, 1807. His remains were removed here around the same time as Colonel Hunt here in April of 1904. And like I said, he's buried somewhere in the section. His name was Private Richard Gentry, the other Revolutionary War hero that was buried here in this cemetery. But he was present at the capture of Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown on October 19, 1781. And after the Revolution, he moved westward, fighting in the various Indian Wars. He died in 1843 near Richmond, Kentucky. And his remains were moved here in 1958. And now I'm going to show you all the Medal of Honor recipients who are buried here in this cemetery, their final resting places or memorials, starting with Lieutenant Commander Bruce Avery Van Voorhis. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously for service in the U.S. Navy, bombing Squadron 102 in recognition of actions during the Battle of the Solomon Islands on July 6, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Van Voorhis gave his life for country during a solo mission against the Japanese-held Greenwich Island. And his remains were buried right here on March 15th, 1950. Here's another Medal of Honor recipient, George Hobday, who fought in the Indian Wars. He received the Medal of Honor while serving in the U.S. Army, Company A, 7th U.S. Cavalry, for actions at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota on December 29th, 1890. He died in 1891 on December 22nd. Not buried too far from him is Sergeant David Ryan, who also fought in the Indian Wars. He received the Medal of Honor while serving in the U.S. Army, Company G, 5th U.S. Infantry, for actions at Cedar Creek and elsewhere in the Montana Territory from October 21st, 1876 to January 8, 1877. Ryan passed away in 1896 and is buried right here. And also, First Sergeant Alonzo Stokes. He received the Medal of Honor while serving in the U.S. Army, Company H, 6th U.S. Cavalry, for actions at the Wichita River, Texas, on July 12, 1870. He died in 1876 on July 4th. And next up is First Lieutenant Donald D. Pucket. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously for service in the U.S. Army Air Corps, 343rd Bombardment Squadron, 98th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, in recognition of actions after his aircraft was damaged over Romania on July 9th, 1944. First Lieutenant Pucket ordered his crew to abandon ship, but he remained on board when 3 of his men were unable to parachute out and tried to regain control of the plane as it crashed. His remains were buried here on October 31st, 1950. Lorenzo Immell. He received the Medal of Honor while serving in the U.S. Army, Company F, 2nd U.S. Artillery, for actions at Wilson's Creek, Missouri, August 10th, 1861. And he died on October 31st, 1912. And just a few graves next to him is another Medal of Honor, Martin Schubert. First Lieutenant Martin Schubert received the Medal of Honor while serving in the U.S. Army, Company E, 26th New York Infantry, for actions at Fredericksburg, Virginia, on December 13th, 1862. He died on April 25th, 1912. Here is another Medal of Honor recipient memorialized here, Ralph Cheli. And about him, he served during World War II, received the Medal of Honor for service in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the 405th Bombardment Squadron, 38th Bombardment Group, 5th Air Force, in recognition of actions as squadron leader during an air attack on the Dagua Airdrome. Major Cheli's plane was struck, but he completed the mission and instructed his wingman to lead the formation as he crashed into the sea near Wewak, New Guinea on August 18th, 1943. Initially believed to have been killed, his award was presented in October. Major Cheli actually died on March 6, 1944, but he was a prisoner of war. And his remains were buried here on March 21st, 1950. And this was as part of a group. And these were prisoners of war. And now we're going to go into some more notables that are here, buried here in the cemetery. And we're going to start with Michael Joseph Blassie. For many years, he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, but not under his name. He was the tomb of the unknown soldier for many, many years, until 1998, when, I mean, there's a lot of story and detail that goes like how his remains were uncovered. But he was born here in St. Louis, Missouri, and he attended St. Louis University High School and graduated in 1966. He then entered the United States Air Force Academy, where he graduated in 1970. And then he attended undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base, and he received his aeronautical rating as an Air Force pilot in 1971. And so he was deployed to Southeast Asia. Blassie died when his A-37B Dragonfly was shot down near An Loc in what was then South Vietnam. And he is the recipient of many awards. But I want to move this flag real quick to see what it says here. Yeah, from 1984 to 1998. Now, at the time, yeah, DNA testing was becoming more and more modern, and technology kept progressing and improving, and thanks to DNA testing and with the permission of Blassie's family, they were able to identify him, thankfully, and his remains were, of course, interred here. But I hope Blassie continues to rest in peace and power. Over here is a mass grave for 123 of the 139 victims of the Palawan Massacre. And it talks about it right here. And here are their names, but... Alright, victims of the Japanese Massacre, Puerto Princesa, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, in Palawan, and it happened December 14th, 1944. These U.S. prisoners of war of the Japanese were on the island of Palawan PI as slave laborers building an airfield for the Japanese military. Believing that an invasion by the U.S. forces was imminent, the prisoners were forced into 3 tunnel air raid shelters, thus following orders from the Japanese High Command to dispose of prisoners by any means available. Buckets of gasoline were thrown inside the shelters, followed by flaming torches. Those not instantly killed by the explosions ran, burning from the tunnels, and were machine gunned and bayoneted to death. Oh my gosh. I'm just going to take a look at the names here. Wow. And here is, quote-unquote, a famous grave at the local level, St. Louis, that is. John, also known as Jack Buck. He served in World War II, and he lived from 1924 until his death of cancer in 2002. He was awarded the Purple Heart, and many fans have left baseballs and among many items here at his grave site. But I mean, Jack Buck's legacy no words can explain it. I mean, I grew up listening to him on the radio. He was pretty much the voice of the Cardinals, and he is widely credited of making St. Louis a great and major sports town, or sports city. I mean, the way he made calls on the radio, like, "That's a winner, excuse me while I stand up and cheer." I mean, there's many others. I mean, his raspy voice was iconic on KMOX for many years, and I mean, him and Harry Carey, as well as in later years Mike Shannon, I mean, they were like golden behind the microphone. And if you do want to read a book, I mean, if you do like to read memoirs or autobiographies, I definitely recommend That's a Winner. That was written by Buck himself. That's a really good book. He talks about his experience and being part of a great sports organization, and a lot of personal stories, some drama here and there. But one of his last public appearances was when Busch Stadium reopened right after 9/11 terrorist attacks, and he gave a really heartwarming speech that nobody will ever forget. Brings a tear to everyone's eye when you hear it. I mean, you can find it here on YouTube. But here's the final resting place for John, also known as Jack Buck. And yes, all of his kids are in broadcasting, including, yes, Joe Buck. And here's another famous or notable burial. This is Robert K. McFerrin Sr., and he served during World War II in the U.S. Army. Beloved husband, dad, and grandpa. But he was a classical singer, which was rare for an African-American man during a certain time period. But he served as an inspiration to singers of color who followed, especially men. And according to George Shirley, who followed in his footsteps, Robert McFerrin Sr.'s heart was that of a giant. As one of the world's greatest singers and courageous pioneers, he instilled within me and countless other black males the resolve to pursue our destinies as performers in the profession of opera, in spite of the personal hardships he endured. Now, he was born in Marianna, Arkansas, but he did reside mostly here in St. Louis, especially in his later years. He died in 2006. And he was also the first African-American to perform at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And of course, his son is Robert McFerrin Jr., also better known as Bobby McFerrin. He had that one song, Don't Worry, Be Happy, which hit #1 in the 80s. But this is the final resting place of Robert K. McFerrin Sr. And I can't leave out another great legendary hero and musician from St. Louis, Johnnie Johnson Sr. He was an American pianist who played jazz, blues, and rock and roll. And he is mostly famous for his work with Chuck Berry, but in addition to his musical achievements, he was posthumously awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for breaking racial barriers in the military as a Montford Point Marine, where he endured racism and inspired social change while integrating the previously all-white Marine Corps during World War II. Now, he's originally from Fairmount, West Virginia. He was born there in 1924, but he spent most of his life here. But yeah, Chuck Berry, I mean, he performed in a lot of Chuck Berry recordings, a lot of his most notable ones. But I mean, their friendship wasn't always, friendship. Like, just a few years before Johnson's death, Johnson actually sued Chuck Berry, alleging he deserved writing credits or co-writing credits and royalties for dozens of songs, including Roll Over Beethoven, Sweet Little 16, which those credit Berry alone. But the case was eventually dismissed because too many years had passed since the songs in dispute were written. In 2001, Johnson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the Sidemen category. And this was because of a campaign by the businessman George Turek and Johnson's biographer Travis Fitzpatrick, as well as the Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards. How about that? And he also has a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. But the Johnnie Johnson Blues and Jazz Festival is held annually in Fairmount, West Virginia, just a few blocks of where Johnson was born. So no doubt his legacy does live on. And here is just a close-up of his stone, loving husband, father, grandfather, and friend. And here is another musician, Dennis Edwards Jr., who lived from 1943 to 2018. It looks like he died 2 days before his 75th birthday. says here, loving husband, Temptations forever. That's right. Now, he is best known as the singer who replaced David Ruffin in the Temptations back in 1968. But before his music career, he was also, he was always involved with music. But in 1961, January of that year to December 1963, Dennis Edwards served as a field artilleryman in the U.S. Army, and he spent most of his enlistment stationed in Europe. His last major duty assignment was with Headquarters Battery, the 2nd Howitzer Battalion, 35th Artillery, 7th Army. He became a specialist 4th class in the Army. And then he later went to music. He was singing with his father's church as a kid, and he was born in Fairfield, Alabama. When he was a toddler, his family moved to Detroit. They actually moved all over the place, but he signed to Motown Records. He had formed his own groups. He sang with the Contours, but it was after they hit it big with Do You Love Me? But Dennis Edwards, ironically, was good friends with the Temptations lead vocalist David Ruffin, who, now, actually, let me back up. If you ever see the Temptations miniseries, like the biography movie, I don't know what streaming service you can catch it on. It's probably on I know it's on Fandango at Home app, but if you do get a chance to watch it, you gotta watch it just to see the whole story about the whole Temptations. And arguably the Temptations' biggest years were during the mid 1960s, when David Ruffin was singing lead with a group. But they did have continued success into the 1970s and minimal success in the 1980s. But it was he was singing lead with the Contours one night, and Temptations members Eddie Kendricks and Otis Williams, who was the founding member, it sounded like they were desperately looking for somebody to replace Ruffin, and they saw something special in Mr. Edwards, and so that was when he said, you know what, you're welcome to join our group. David's acting up, he's, blah blah blah, a little drama going on. But ironically, years later, Edwards himself would be kicked out of the group. And now, he did sing lead on some of the 1970s songs, and reportedly he was unhappy with that song. That song, Papa Was a Rolling Stone? And the first lyric goes, it was the 3rd of September, my daddy died, blah blah blah. Well, he actually got mad because of that, because it reminded him of his own father's death. However, he later admitted that his dad passed away on the 3rd of October instead of September. But they still went with that lyric that was written by Norman Whitfield, who, by the way, just recently was announced he's going to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And speaking of which, now Edwards did not get along later. He did reunite with the group many times on occasion in later years, but he did splinter off into the Temptations Review, and he had a brief successful solo career. Like, he hit #2 on the R&B charts with a duet with Sita Garrett, and a few other lower charting singles on the Billboard R&B chart. But he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Temptations, and rightfully so. Like I said, he was there for many of their hit recordings, like Just My Imagination and Happy People, all them. So why is he buried in St. Louis? Well, in later years, his mother ended up in St. Louis. I'm not really quite sure the whole story behind that, but he did want to be closer to his mom, so he bought a home. I believe it was somewhere in North County, or maybe it was North City, St. Louis. Florissant sounds about right, but he spent his quiet years here in St. Louis. Now, I did have the privilege of seeing him perform live one time. He only sang one song, and that was at the grand opening of Peabody Opera House, which is now the Stifel Theater in downtown St. Louis. But this was back in October 2011, and it was a grand event. All of St. Louis's elite was there, but Aretha Franklin did a set there, and ironically he was actually in a relationship with Aretha Franklin back in the 1970s, and he reportedly was the inspiration of her song Daydreaming. But anyway, Dennis Edwards fittingly joined Aretha on stage for one song, and I can't remember the name of it. I mean, what song it was, but I mean, I'll put it on the screen once I get it. But either way, rest in peace, Dennis Edwards Jr. Temptations Forever. And lastly, I'm in section 81, and here along this section with section 80 there are many mass graves and memorials, and I'm standing in front of one, and I believe these are where all these men died on January 14th, 1943. And one of the names is Eric M. Knight, and you probably don't know who he is, but Find a Grave does list him as a famous interment here. But I didn't know who he was until I read his biography. Now let me ask you guys this. How many of you have heard of Lassie? Yes, the dog. How many of you have heard of the TV show, the movies, the comic books? Well, he is the man behind that. Now, he was born in the UK, and then his parents were divorced, but his mother married an American, and so he relocated to the United States. And then he wanted to be a writer, and so that he did before he went off to war. But in 1938, the New York Times was having a contest, I believe it was. He wrote a short story called Lassie, Come Home. And of course, newspapers were the big medium at the time, and the public loved the story about a dog, and it was actually based on Eric M. Knight's dog. And so many movie studios, based on because of the popularity of the story, they were buying the movie rights to it. And of course, I don't need to say how successful the Lassie franchise has, because yeah, Lassie, as we all know, is a collie, well, fictional. And Lassie is one of a few animals that is on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Yeah. But Eric M. Knight was also a hero along with these many men. And I'm going to take a look at some of these other mass graves as well. Like these died in an airplane crash on May 22nd, 1944. And then these men were killed in a crash in Vietnam in February 19. I mean, these men saw sad endings. And here's one last one that I'm going to read off. These men were killed in an aircraft accident in Alaska on November 27th, 1970. So sad. All right, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Historically Marked. I am Jason. Always remember our heroes and those who made the ultimate sacrifice so we can enjoy our freedoms. I am Jason at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Sign off.